The content of this podcast has not been evaluated by Health Canada or the FDA. It is educational in nature and should not be taken as medical advice. Always consult a qualified medical professional to see if a diet, lifestyle change, or supplement is right for you. Any supplements mentioned are not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease. Please note that the opinions of the guests or hosts are their own and may not reflect those of Advanced Orthomolecular Research Incorporated. Welcome to Supplementing Health, a podcast presented by Advanced Orthomolecular Research. We are all about applying evidence-based and effective dietary, lifestyle, and natural health product strategies for your optimal health. In each episode, we will feature very engaging clinicians and experts from the world of functional and naturopathic medicine to help achieve our mission to empower people to live their best lives naturally. Hello, thanks for tuning into Supplementing Health. Today we are excited to be welcoming back Dr. NavNirat Nibber, naturopathic doctor, to continue our conversation on the impact of sugar in our long-term health. Hey, Nirat, welcome back.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So last week we left off talking about how artificial sweeteners play into insulin resistance and the pathways in our brain that lead to sugar cravings and maybe lack of satiety when it comes to how full we feel after eating some of these foods. And some researchers have speculated that artificial sweeteners such as aspartame could be toxic to the brain as they increase inflammation. What's your take on this piece around the inflammation that's caused by them?
Yeah, and this is an area that, again, I think we're still learning about, but the impacts, again, it's more that we're activating some of these pathways, and anytime you flood with too much sweetness or you're activating too much of those reward pathways, you can induce some inflammation there, because your body still has to manage and mitigate that excess fuel source that's coming in all of a sudden. So you do get risk for things like advanced glycated end products. They're called AGEs, which can induce oxidative stress and inflammation. So you can see that there's this huge cascade that we can start going down, and so there is concern for some of these alternatives, which actually were touted as an alternative to sugar, but maybe they're not what they need to be, which is why sometimes people who are solely consuming Diet Coke are still getting some of those adverse negative health benefits. So again, let's just limit total consumption and replace our Diet Cokes with water or flavored fruit water. It becomes really mindful, even like we don't want to be duped into thinking that just because it's a artificial sweetener or a low calorie sweetener, low fat is always a big area of concern because they compensate with so much more sugar. But I think I'm digressing. Ultimately, yes, there is this risk that it could be toxic, and that exact pathway we're still elucidating. So
too much excess sugar can also create inflammation in the body, can it not?
Yeah, when we're talking about those added sugars, that is part of why it's so bad to consume so much of these high fructose corn syrups or sucralose, the added table sugar, because it does increase that inflammation in the body. What it's doing is you're activating this, if there's too much that can't be taken up in the cell, then it's kind of sitting around either in the bloodstream or in the gut, and can actually cause an inflammatory cascade. And then you're just sitting in this toxic soup of inflammation. And what that can also do is it's almost like you've ramped up production too fast, and you're creating all of these toxic byproducts or reactive oxygenated species in the cell. So it's almost like a kitchen that isn't properly ventilated, and all the smoke starts filling up. And that's where we start to get a lot of that damage and inflammation in the gut. damage to cells, which is with those reactive oxygenated species. And then again, because you have excess sugar molecules, they start attaching onto proteins, and then you get these things called advanced glycated end products. When you've attached that sugar to that protein, it is going to be really concerning. It bulks it up, right? So anywhere it goes, you're now restricted that movement of that protein. So it's kind of like clogging up the drain. You see this a lot with cataracts in the eye. They get advanced glycated end products. So part of why a lot of diabetics get, cataracts is because these sugar molecules are attaching onto those proteins, and we need something to come clip it off.
Okay, so speaking of the inflammation in the gut, how that plays into irritable bowel syndrome and other inflammatory conditions, how does that impact those conditions specifically? Like, is that usually a trigger, or is it something that can then add to an already existing condition, or how does that play into that?
Yeah. And like everything I've said today, it is a complex process where it is kind of a chicken and the egg. We don't know if certainly we know that excess sugar consumption will exacerbate an inflammation, and it can induce, but it is interesting to see the etiology of what happens first. I think a big piece that we need to also bring into this discussion is the role of the microbiome in gut health. We know these good bacteria are often protective. They help us metabolize, break down our nutrients with absorption. Basically, our microbiome is the goat. It is very important, and we should not overlook it. And sugars, we know, do impact the makeup of this microbiome. We know that sugars will, preferentially feed certain types of bacteria, and it does shift the makeup of our microbiome because these act as prebiotics. So if you're having excessive amounts if you're basically feeding maybe the types of bacteria that you don't want, or in so doing, they're creating a lot of byproducts of the bacterial metabolism, then our bodies have to take that on as well. So this could also be, this is kind of like the working hypothesis right now for why sugar is really inflammatory for particularly things like IBS and colitis, because you're actually shifting and throwing off your microbiome.
Okay, so then is there a link between the type of bacteria that is in someone's microbiome and their propensity towards insulin resistance?
Yeah, and that's a really interesting, probably the gastroenterologist, that's the $1 million question for anyone supplementing probiotics is or creating probiotics, there is a lot, the strains we use, the dosages of those strains we use, there's a lot coming out on which of those strains are really important. Now, I don't know if we have the time to go into each of them, but strains like Bifidobacterium longum or BB536, that's a strain I know is really being well characterized and understood for promoting gut health, and also promoting the formation of short chain fatty acids. So short chain fatty acids will help, so they're produced by the bacteria, and those can help fortify the cells and offset some of the response to the sugar. So I would say that those are the strains that you obviously want to promote and propagate. And then, those, the bad strains, if you will, these are being, I think it's more it's called dysbiosis. So it's how much more of those are growing and where are they growing? Have they migrated up to the small intestine, or are they staying in lower intestine? And yeah, I, you know, do see a lot more understanding, a lot more research coming out. There's papers and papers and papers related to this. So I do think we'll probably be able to start characterizing those specific strains, and then also our genetic propensity or response to certain strains. Like that's all coming out because we have access now to genetic testing and microbiome analysis through stool testing. We have all these tools, so I do think that that'll probably become much more clear than this answer that I'm giving you, which is, yeah, we know that there's a link there. We are still trying to characterize and identify exactly what that link is.
Okay, cool. And then the other piece of that I was wondering about is I know butyrate is a short chain fatty acid that's been getting a lot of love over the last few years as far as all the good that it does for our body. Does it have a role in reducing insulin resistance or improving those sugar cravings, that sugar utilization picture?
Yes, absolutely. So they're looking at short chain fatty acids as a group, and butyrate in particular, as one, fortifying the intent. So that first point of entry for a lot of these sugars, so those intestinal cells, those enterocytes, the more you fortify them, the more you strengthen that ability to restrict access and free flow of sugar or fructose into the cell, the more you're going to be able to then prevent it from going into the bloodstream. And that response, that hormone response from the pancreas. So what is really exciting is that these short chain fatty acids are being examined as therapies for individuals who either have some dysbiosis or blood sugar dysregulation. And I think it's going to be really exciting to see in the next few years how much more we're going to utilize that. It also is really going to be helpful in ensuring that we have, healthy blood flow, cardiovascular flow, because in kind of an indirect way, because it's reducing some of that inflammation and oxidative pressure that arises from that inflammation of having, I guess, damaged enterocytes. So yeah, butyrate, short chain fatty acids are going to be really good. It also helps, pull out and act as basically like a really good fiber. And so we're going to see more cholesterol reductions and management to offload some of that burden on the liver.
Okay, so in the vein of cardiovascular health, pun intended, there's a 2014 study that found an association between high sugar diets and a greater risk of dying from heart disease. I think the study was done over 15 years, and people that had 17 to 21% of their calories from added sugar had a 38% higher risk of dying from CVD compared to those who consumed 8% or less of their calories from added sugar. And you had kind of talked a little bit about how people should be aiming for 5% of the calorie intake to be from sugar. But can you explain kind of that mechanism of action that's playing into heart health in particular here?
So what's really interesting about this is that it can be related to our, I guess, three processes. So our nitric oxide production, nitric oxide is a small molecule that is transiently produced and helps essentially with blood flow. So vasodilation, and it helps improve that blood flow. And to do that, you need plasticity, or you need your arteries and blood vessels to be able to expand and contract as needed. And nitric oxide basically helps with this through, different pathways like the VEGF pathway. But what sugar can do is block some of those pathways and block some of that production. So we're actually seeing that the vessels themselves are less responsive. And then it's almost like you start getting that hardening. If you get a hardening, then you're at risk for, you're not getting the proper oxygen to the tissues, and you're at risk for a cardiovascular incident. So that's one aspect. Then we do know that the sugar itself, as I mentioned, can increase just specific oxidative stress in tissues, and that includes the heart. So it can include or induce some of that stress on the heart cells themselves, and that again can increase the inflammation to that area, and then you're left with another cardiovascular incident. And then the third way would, I think, be related to liver function and cholesterol management. So this is more related to those high fructose sugars. It gets processed, like I mentioned, in the liver and metabolized in the liver. And when you get a backlog of that, you're also then you're basically jamming up the whole system. And that can also lead to excess cholesterol or reduced cholesterol clearance. And then when you have high cholesterol, that's where we're getting those deposits in the arteries, and you get these plaque formations. So it is really important to recognize that while maybe it's not the most direct, it is impacting very important pathways related to cardiovascular function. So it's important that we start being a little more mindful of that. And that's also why things like the Mediterranean diet are considered so beneficial in cardiovascular disease. But you'll notice the Mediterranean diet is lots of natural foods and not as much processed food, so less sugar, less sugary foods. There's not a lot of sugar in a Mediterranean type diet or the DASH type diet.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, we do know that nutrients and minerals work synergistically to perform various tasks within the body. So it would make sense that if we're introducing kind of an overload of something that really doesn't have a ton of nutritional value, like it's been stripped down to just kind of one little piece, like added sugar often is, that it would have all these varying effects on the body. So is in that same, I guess, realm of thinking, are there any nutrients that impact the way that sugar is utilized, that if we are consuming sugar, that when we eat it with these different nutrients, it actually makes it better for us?
Mm-hmm. It does make a difference, what we're consuming the sugar with. And that is why, fruit as a whole fruit is very different from fruit as a fruit juice. And I think it comes down to three things. One is fiber, 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 fiber. I am a big fan of fiber, and I think we all need to be consuming more. What fiber does is essentially locks into a matrix those sugars. And so again, you get a slower infusion. So you'll notice when we go back to the glycemic index, glycemic load, those foods with higher fiber content intrinsically have a bit of a lower glycemic index, because again, you're not flooding the system too fast. You can slowly infuse that. Another important aspect of that is, what are other things, whether they're antioxidants, polyphenols, flavonoids, that are actually able to offset and reduce some of the negative impact that you would have from, too much sugar, because again, that's going to mitigate some of the risk of the sugar. So those really brightly colored fruits, blueberries, and they're antioxidant rich. So those are going to help mitigate that. And then, I mean, honestly, I feel like it's the fiber. In terms of nutrients themselves, we know that things like chromium can be really helpful for that. Now, sometimes if we're looking at the reward pathways for those sugar cravings, like we had talked about earlier, those, like I had said, are dopamine mediated. So it could also be in relation to making sure you're getting B vitamins and all the precursors to dopamine so that you're able to mount proper responses. So that can also be related to, proper sugar management. And then making sure you have a good microbiome. Basically,
Well, so
eat, move, sleep well, rest.
then all the sort of generic recommendations that
I
we hear
know.
everywhere.
Doesn't it always seem so reductionist? It's like, just be healthy. And it's like, but how?
Yeah.
Like, I'm
So then are there certain deficiencies like that sugar cravings can be indicative of?
yeah. So again, it could be related to, well, yeah, there's a few. So it could be related to if you're really craving like those dark chocolates, that could be more related to magnesium. A sugar craving could be indicative of some insulin resistance building. It can also be related to cortisol dysregulation. And we haven't talked about this too much, but when we're talking about the stress response, sometimes when we have a elevated stress response, the cortisol is mismanaged, and that can increase our desire to get fuel. And so our body is saying, get me some sugars. I need energy fast. And that's the fastest way to get it. So cortisol dysregulation can also be a big part of that.
So cortisol, as we know, is a hormone, which also
Mhm.
makes me think then about our other hormone profiles that get affected by what we eat and whatnot. Now, PCOS is a hormonal condition that is often associated with insulin resistance. Why is that?
Because so PCOS is a condition that exists on a spectrum, and there is a strong link with insulin resistance, but it's actually related back to our sex hormone function. So our estrogen, progesterone levels, and fat cells. So it is a very complex, PCOS is kind of this complex interplay between our blood sugar, our sex hormones, and then just our general lifestyle. And it's really hard to pinpoint exactly where it's coming from, but we do know that there's a connection. And those who start to exhibit, things like very high free fatty acids in the blood, so high triglycerides, maybe abnormal insulin, so fasting insulin will be off. Often do also have this correlation between their estrogen, progesterone pathways are a little bit off. And what can happen is this can be both related to weight gain and it can exacerbate weight gain. So in fat cells, that estrogen is cyclizing, and when it kind of cyclizes in the fat cell, it also turns into testosterone. So then you get this elevation of androgens, and that's where we see things like that cystic acne and coarse hair growth on the face for women. And so we're combining now the endocrine function as well as food. So those who are on low sugar diets uh, do seem to benefit from, because you're re-correcting that insulin management, and it is having a positive effect on both. It's shrinking the fat cells, so there's less estrogen cyclizing, but then it's also helping manage your estrogen output by both the ovaries and then from a higher central nervous system perspective.
Would PMS cravings have a similar underlying cause then?
Yes, I mean, in that it's often related to that fluctuation with estrogen. And sometimes we do see with more estrogen dominant conditions. So when you have too much estrogen and you're not getting that proper decline before your period, there can be, yeah, it can be more associated with those blood sugar dysregulation. So it can be more that you're craving these sugars, but yeah.
And
Sorry.
so what can, like if people are suffering from those cravings, particularly around their cycle or from hormonal imbalances, what are some of the things they can do to help manage those cravings while addressing that underlying root cause?
Yeah, so of course, while you're addressing the estrogen progesterone ratios, the cortisol for stress, um, certainly engaging in both regular exercise, because that's the fastest and most well described way to mitigate and reduce the impacts of insulin resistance. Because now you're basically repurposing that fuel source, and your body responds accordingly. So exercise as much as you can, just get moving. Um, and then the second thing again would be eat a high fiber, nutrient rich, uh, low processed food diet, and that will influence your hormones as well. And part of that is making sure that sugars are paired with proteins, so that you're not just eating those sugars alone and flooding the system. So again, that's where a healthy plate comes in. So make sure that you have vegetables on your plate, that you have healthy fats on your plate, and that you have very rich fibrous foods on your plate for every meal.
Awesome. Okay, and so then the other thing that comes to mind when we think hormonal imbalance and PMS is often acne, and everyone dreads acne. Lots of people suffer from it, and we know there's many factors that play into skin health, not just hormones, but inflammation as well. And knowing that sugar can impact both of those hormone profiles as well as overall body inflammation, how do you determine when skin conditions such as acne are due purely to poor diet or excess sugar consumption rather than other potential underlying causes?
Yeah, I mean, we always want to do a thorough intake, and we're assessing for what someone's dietary habits are like, but we're also looking at, um, if they're experiencing any menstrual irregularities, things like that, and that can help guide us. But also, the type of acne. So if it's more cystic acne, then we can kind of start thinking in the realm of hormonal mismanagement. We can also do something very simple, which is cut out sugar and see if there is a response, because it tends to respond quite quickly. So within 2 weeks of cutting out sugar, from added sugars from the diet, people start to see changes. And so, yeah, it's a simple, quick test to assess if it really is that sugar. And then, because there's such a strong link between our sugar consumption and our gut health and gut inflammation, and skin is kind of the canary in the mine if something's wrong with our gut, again, there tends to be this cascade effect where everything kind of clears up magically. And so if we know that, then we can again start to work backwards. And I think as not NDs, we're always trying to assess that deeper root cause. So whether that's additional lab testing we're doing, whether we're still engaging in specialized testing, that's always important. But yeah, sometimes just removal of that is the easiest test we can do.
And it's a safe one people can do on their own as well, correct? Like there's no real concerns with cutting sugar out of the diet that you'd be lacking certain nutrients or anything.
Yeah, no, I mean, you don't want to be calorically restricting to the point of, we're talking about added sugars. So yeah, reducing those to those safe levels, you can absolutely do at home without anybody needing to monitor that.
Now, earlier, or I think in last week's episode, you were talking about advanced glycation end products, and those can play a big role in aging and signs of aging in the skin, can they not?
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, the wrinkling, the sunspots or those liver spots, so darkening, hyperpigmentation, can all be related to those ages.
And eating sugars with fiber and protein reduces the likelihood of those ages, or is that something that will happen kind of no matter what, and it's more about the detoxification process?
So I would say that it's more about the detoxification process, but certainly when we eat the fibers and the proteins, we're allowing our body to process those sugars and excrete it in a timely manner. So they're kind of one and the same. Also, if someone has a propensity to forming these advanced glycated end products, then, like I said, you need something to kind of come and clip off those sugars. And that's where a lot of our antioxidants, a lot of the beneficial nutrients in a lot of the whole foods we eat come in and can actually do that for us. So we already get that from food. So for example, when you eat or when you consume green tea is a really great source of catechins, epicatechins, and they are really helpful in reducing some of those, I guess, the damage from ages and from reactive oxygenated species. So it kind of works on two levels. So yeah, definitely how we consume the sugar, when we consume it, and if we can start to consume it with things like that we, for thousands of years, a lot of people have been consuming, things like green tea, chamomile tea, even curcumin from turmeric. Turmeric that's known to be really helpful for that. Guava leaf and guava fruit helps. So yeah, there's a lot naturally that we've been consuming that already kind of helps reduce that.
This is such an interesting topic because I think even though we've done this or continued this conversation for a second episode, that there's still we're still skimming the surface. We could do a deep dive almost into each of these kind of subtopics that we've touched on. But unfortunately, we've again hit the end of our time. So if any of our listeners want to learn more from you, they can actually check out AOR's blog, which is at aor.ca, as well as check out our bi-monthly publication of Healthbeat, where you often write different articles on various topics as well.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. It's an exciting topic, and I know so many of my answers were, well, it depends, but isn't that the nature of the human body?
It truly is, yeah. And science too, right? We don't always get a concrete black and white answer in this field.
Exactly. And it's always changing. It's so dynamic. But thank you so much. And this has been great.
Yeah, thank you. As always, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for listening to Supplementing Health. For more information about our guests, past shows, and future topics, please visit aor.ca/podcast or aor.us/podcast. Do you have a topic you want us to cover? We invite you to engage with us on social media to request a future topic or email us at marketing@aor.ca.